Hello and welcome to our virtual book launch featuring Devin Zane Shaw with his book, Philosophy of Antifascism, Punching Nazis and Fighting White Supremacy, and J. Moufawad-Paul with his book, Demarcation and Demystification, Philosophy and Its Limits. We will discuss radical philosophy, anti-fascism, and many other related topics tonight, so stay tuned as this will be a very exciting presentation. Now, this book launch is being presented by several sponsors: Rowman and Littlefield, Kursplebedeb, or Left Wing Books, Another Story Bookshop, People's Co-op Bookstore, Toronto Against Fascism, and Revolutionary Voices podcasts. Now, to cover today's program, we will first have a few guest speakers, the sponsors themselves, speak about their organizations. Then we'll have Devin speak on his book, followed by Josh speaking about his. After, they will both have an exchange of questions together, and we will listen in on this discussion. At the end, following this exchange of questions, we will answer some questions from the audience. So during this entire program, we ask that the audience to submit any and all questions or comments, and we will answer each question accordingly at the end of the program. To submit a question or a comment, just click on the bottom center of your Zoom window where it says Q&A. Now, write in the question or comment and click submit. Okay, let's begin the program with a message from the sponsors. Our first sponsor speaker is Anju from Another Story Bookshop. She unfortunately could not attend tonight, but she did leave us a message which I will read. She says, Another Story Bookshop is proud to support the dual launch for Philosophy of Antifascism by Devin Zane Shaw and Demarcation and Demystification by J. Moufawad-Paul. Both books are in stock. Our store is not open for browsing, but orders can be placed online at anotherstory.ca. We are open for curbside pickup 5 days a week, and we are also doing local delivery and shipment via Canada Post. We are pleased to offer personalized copies of Demarcation and Demystification, and if you would like Josh to sign a book for you, please order online at anotherstory.ca and indicate in the notes section that you would like the book signed. The deadline is Tuesday, December 8th at noon. And that is from Anju from Another Story Bookshop. Now, our next sponsor speaker is Carl from Kursplebedeb, aka Left Wing Books. He unfortunately could not attend the event, but he did leave us a recording, and we will play that video right now.
This is Carl from Kursplebedeb at leftwingbooks.net. Thanks to everyone who put this event on. I'm real happy to be able to be associated with these two important books. For those of you who don't know, Kursplebedeb is a publisher and book distro that has been operating in Canada for over 20 years now. We started in 1998, first mainly buttons and t-shirts, but increasingly as the years wore on, more and more, and today almost exclusively written materials. We specialize in radical left literature. We're non-sectarian. We try and take stuff from a variety of tendencies and schools of thought: anarchism, left communism, Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Trotskyism, and others. Pre-COVID, we would sell our books at various events and university campuses. Since March of this year, we have been 100% online, of course, via our website, which is at leftwingbooks.net. We offer free local delivery in Montreal, normally once a week. We drive around dropping things off, and free shipping anywhere in North America for orders of $50 or more, which incidentally means if you purchase one of each of the books being discussed tonight, I believe you qualify for free shipping. So yeah, thanks again for the organizers of this event, and I look forward to hearing what everyone has to say.
All right, our next sponsor speaker is Frankie from Rowman and Littlefield. Unfortunately, she could not be here tonight, but we do have a video message from Frankie that we'll listen to just right now.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining the event. I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Frankie, I'm the acquisitions editor for philosophy at Rowman Littlefield, and I worked with Devin Shaw to develop his wonderful book, Philosophy of Antifascism, and with Devin, Storm and LaRose to put together the wider project, the book series Living Existentialism, which LaRose will be giving you a kind of more in-depth brief of after my little bit here. I apologise in advance for the recording. There's quite a significant time difference between where I am here in London and where you all are. But I thought it was very important for me to express some international anti-fascist solidarity, especially in this moment of the continuing encroachment of the far right on everyday life and discourse and politics. The book originally came together from discussions I had with Devin and the material that he sent to me. As we were working on it, it became clear that the questions and the desire for intervention that the book was provoking was part of a much bigger calling to think about how we can seriously deploy, instrumentalize, and reimagine existentialism, a strand of philosophy that has a certain reputation and one that we all believed was unrepresentative and inaccurate for what it is and what it can do. The book was originally called Punching Nazis, which, as you will see, is retained in the subtitle. And we changed it to Philosophy of Antifascism, not because punching Nazis isn't the overall recommendation and intention for this book, but because we didn't want to portray the book as being in any way flippant. This is a serious intellectual engagement, a philosophical work to address anti-fascist militancy and how we approach the ongoing struggle against neo and derivative fascisms. The one of the blurbers of the book actually put it rather well and said the necessity was for the book to help fight the bastards. And this is exactly what Devin seeks to do, with some help from Fanon, from Beauvoir, and from Rancière. It's a marvellous book. It's my time up. It's a marvellous book, and I'm extremely proud of having worked on it. I want to congratulate both Josh and Devin on their impressive books, and I'll hand over to LaRose, as I said, the series editor for Living Existentialism, to go into greater detail. Thanks so much for having me. Good luck with everything, and enjoy the rest of the event. Bye.
Okay, again, that was LaRose from Rowman and Littlefield, excuse me. Our final sponsor speaker is LaRose T. Paris. She is an associate professor of Africana Studies at Lehman College of the City University of New York. Her first book, Being Apart, it's called Being Apart, Theoretical and Existential Resistance in Africana Literature. And it was awarded the Nicolas Guillan Prize for Outstanding Book and Philosophical Literature by the Caribbean Philosophical Association in 2016. Her fiction and criticism have appeared in, excuse me if I pronounce this wrong, Kalaloo, Entre les Traces, the Review of Education, Pedagogy, and Cultural Studies, and the Journal of Pan-African Studies as well. Paris is co-editor of Rowman and Littlefield's, quote, Living Existentialism, end quote, book series, which focuses on creative, generative scholarship that expands discussions of existentialism by highlighting its diverse lineages in anti-colonial, Africana, feminist, and indigenous thought. Now let's welcome LaRose.
Thank you very much, Will, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is LaRose Paris, and I'm here as Devin Zane Shaw's co-editor of the Living Existentialism series. And I'll just expand a little bit on what Frankie mentioned, because when we typically think about existentialism, we often, all of us, regardless of our racial and ethnic backgrounds, our nationalities and citizenship, we typically think of post-war Europe, post-World War II Europe. We think of Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. And these two philosophers are pivotal in the existentialist movement. But what we're doing in the series is really looking at a way of shifting the geography of reason. And that's a quote from the Caribbean Philosophical Association. Why do we want to shift the geography of reason? Because we're trying to highlight the fact that philosophical thought has lineages throughout the world, in the global South, among people of color, among indigenous people, and Black thinkers as well. Because typically people who have experienced historical forms of oppression, like colonialism, chattel slavery, etc., and settler colonialism in the case of indigenous people, have grappled with these themes of being, ontological questions, freedom, collective responsibility, and agency for centuries. So what we're really looking to do is broaden the discussion about existentialism so that it's more accurate of the entire human experience. So we look at texts that engage with thinkers from the European continent, as well as thinkers from the global South, indigenous thinkers and thinkers of color, etc. So that's where, when we think about Devin's great work, it's positioned perfectly at that crossroads. And when in Devin's work, Philosophy of Anti-Fascism, he's showing us that anti-fascist thought has three crucial functions, and in my view, and they are: one, practical. Okay, anti-fascist thought has practical application. It also has philosophical roots, and thirdly, it's also an actional philosophy. So in terms of practicality, when Devin introduces us to his work in the book, he really stresses the fact that anti-fascist thought should be seen as a discursive tool and a strategy to undergird current anti-fascist activism. And I think that's a brilliant way to position it. And secondly, the philosophical roots of anti-fascist thought, Devin traces very expertly through the work of Simone de Beauvoir, Aimé Césaire, W.E.B. Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, Jacques Rancière, and Jean-Paul Sartre. And he shows us that anti-fascist thought is inherently egalitarian, and in that it is definitely linked to existential thought as well. And then thirdly, what Devin, to me, is one of the great strengths of the book. He shows us that anti-fascist thought is actional, that we need to think of, as progressives, as radical thinkers and activists, that we need to be willing to embrace militant anti-fascism as opposed to liberal anti-fascism, meaning that physical confrontation is just one means of struggling against these forces of white supremacy that seek to crush us into oblivion, and that we have to be willing to fight for our right to live and to maintain some semblance of civil society. And I'll just close by connecting Devin's book to something that Malcolm X said at his Oxford Union debate back in '65. I think it was the year he was assassinated. And in short, Malcolm X said, "These are extreme times we're living in, and extreme times require extreme measures. And I will align myself with anyone who is in favor of rectifying the miserable condition of human beings on this planet." And right now, with the rise of authoritarianism and fascism, neo-fascism, we're witnessing that same strain of misery. So Devin's book is so timely, and it's a wonderful read. And now I'll introduce Devin so he can talk about it. Okay. Devin Zane Shaw teaches philosophy at Douglas College in Canada. He is the author of Egalitarian Moments from Descartes to Rancière, 2016, and Freedom and Nature in Schelling's Philosophy of Art, published in 2010. He writes about philosophy, political theory, and social movements, and co-edits the Living Existentialism series. So Take it away, Devin.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for the kind words, and thanks everyone for putting this together. It's funny because it's not funny, but we're all used to this by now. It's the third book that I've written, and it's the one that probably had the most involvement, sort of in terms of interaction and discussion with the most people. And it's unfortunate that we have to have a book launch under these kinds of conditions. But that's how the dice roll, and that's how things happen. So yeah, I just want to thank everyone for that. So today I'm going to talk about philosophy of anti-fascism. So here's the book. And I'm just going to try and introduce a couple of the key themes and kind of my motivations and a couple other aspects to this. And read a little bit from the book and then expand on the philosophy just a little bit and then turn it over to Josh. I wrote this book. This started, as I describe it, it started as something else, and then events in North America really took it in a different direction, and I started running with it. And I was working on violence before, but not really sure where I was going with it. It was abstract in a certain way, and the rise of the far right made it something that I had to respond to in an extremely concrete way. And I'm glad that it ended up as it did. There's a couple reasons why I decided to write it. Well, because the question is, why write a book about philosophy and anti-fascism? There are some good books on anti-fascism that are out there that are recent. I stuck Matthew Lyons' Insurgent Supremacists back there behind me. That's a great book studying these supremacist movements. Mark Bray's Antifa handbook came out. There's Shane Burley's Fascism Today, What It Is and How to Fight It. And these are great books. But I felt like it didn't answer something about philosophy that I wanted to do. And so I would say it this way, without taking away from the previous work of other people that I just mentioned in various other topics, is that it hadn't delved into it didn't grab the canon of philosophy, and that's something I wanted to do. And we would say, well, why would I want to do that? Well, first, mainstream philosophy and public intellectuals did a terrible job of handling how to react to militant anti-fascism. So that's the first thing. Right out of the gate in the book, I'll just read you, Chomsky, for instance, who still gets the public intellectual label whenever someone needs a general, and don't get me wrong, there's positives to Chomsky's work, but then he's also kind of like the pull quote guy for people that need the radical. And here's Chomsky. He says, quote, "As for Antifa, it's a minuscule fringe of the left, just as its predecessors were," which is factually wrong. That's not part of the quote, obviously. "It's a major gift to the right." Well, that's strike two for Chomsky, "including the militant right who are exuberant." And that's 3 strikes because, in fact, they weren't exuberant about its existence. So we had Chomsky, we had other people. More recently, from what I've read, Judith Butler has written a book in favor of nonviolence that I think in many ways doesn't take what militant anti-fascism had to say seriously. And those are the issues I wanted to respond to. And then finally, one is kind of feeds into my previous work in the sense that I wanted to link the present back to strands of anti-fascism in the history of continental philosophy, and try to use the topic of anti-fascism to help push. There's 2 things. One, LaRose already mentioned, which was shifting the geography of reason. I've read a lot of people involved with the Caribbean Philosophical Association and Lewis Gordon and Paget Henry, and they advocate for this. And along with that, what I wanted to do is shift the paradigm of understanding continental philosophy in Europe along the lines of anti-fascism rather than along some of the ways that it had been done recently, with things that I viewed basically to be either reactionary for just sticking with the status quo, or actually reactionary like big philosophical movements like speculative realism and all these other things. I felt were a big abandonment of politics and a huge step back, even if they'd say things like they're doing new materialism. So I really wanted to push back against a lot of that. I'm going to read the broader philosophical motivation regarding some of the topics in the book. I've got a couple paragraphs I'm going to read, and then I'm just going to do a couple more quick comments, and that'll pretty much wrap it up. So So I'm just going to start with philosophy and violence, and this is at the end of the first chapter. I have a section about kind of putting it in that perspective. I just jammed through a lot of it already. Philosophy's problematic approach to violence is compounded by the fact that when the discipline actually considers violence, it tends to shift the burden of justification from the oppressor to the oppressed. I place some blame for this position on the influential place Hannah Arendt continues to occupy in scholarship on continental philosophy. Arendt argues in On Violence that political power, or the human ability to act in concert, and violence are quote unquote opposites, or in the Aristotelian terms of On Revolution, that humans are political beings insofar as they are endowed with speech, while violence is quote unquote incapable of speech. One might then conclude that when we are able to proffer reasons for our actions, violence recedes, and that when the oppressed turn to violence, that they bear the burden for introducing violence in the political struggle and stifling speech. There are few more damning indictments of our discipline, although the recent effort of some to launder transphobia as gender-critical feminism certainly ranks among them, than the fact that it is managed through a number of different prejudices to naturalize or occlude the systemic violence of oppression while denouncing in the name of civility, open inquiry, and justice, emancipatory violence. So here in this book, I advocate for a philosophical tradition that maintains that emancipatory violence is, in the words of George Chicory-Omar, quote unquote, a violence that speaks volumes. In other words, I argue that a philosophical understanding of emancipatory violence requires entering into the space of reasons constructed by emancipatory practices. In this regard, my approach is not unlike Chicory-Omar's decolonizing dialectics. In the next two chapters, no, sorry, that's what the book says. In the first two chapters, I read Beauvoir and Rancière's philosophical antecedents to contemporary militant anti-fascism. The purpose, of course, is to demonstrate the anti-fascist character of existentialism and egalitarianism. In chapter 4, I attempt to reconstruct a militant space of reasons to defend militant direct action and emancipatory community self-defense. Militant anti-fascists organize and embrace the diversity of tactics in order to fight the far right by undermining its recruitment efforts and challenging it when it mobilizes campaigns to harass, intimidate, and attack our communities. The reasoning is fairly straightforward. A world where fascists cannot openly organize is better than one where they can. Admittedly, militant anti-fascism here remains a defensive tactic. I conclude in chapter 5 that any meaningful attempt to extirpate fascism and white supremacy in North America must embrace anti-capitalism and anti-settler colonialism, for liberalism, in its role in settler colonialism and as part of a class compromise between the white bourgeoisie and the white working class, has codified whiteness as a form and norm of entitlement and privilege, while the far right draws more or less from, quote, a major social base out of the traditional settler culture, end quote, as Sakai says in one of his writings. In the often quoted eighth thesis of On the Concept of History, Walter Benjamin writes that, quote, the current amazement that the things we are experiencing are still possible in the 20th century is not philosophical, end quote. In a similar manner, to paraphrase Benjamin, the current amazement that the things we are experiencing are still possible in the 21st century is also not philosophical. This amazement is not the beginning of knowledge, unless it is the knowledge that the philosophy that gives rise to it is untenable. I advocate a philosophy of anti-fascism to offer an alternative. So that's from the book. And so now that's the overall picture of where I think the book fits sort of in philosophical discussions very quickly. So there's a couple things I want to just talk about to conclude that sort of walk through some key features of the book for people who are interested. So first, parts of the book are dedicated to examining the role of the three-way fight as it was developed by numerous thinkers in the late 90s and the aughts or 2000s or whatever the hell they're called. And I draw a definition building on the work of Matthew N. Lyons, the book I just mentioned, Insurgent Supremacists, where throughout the book I make the claim that Fascism is a social movement involving a relatively autonomous and insurgent and potentially mass base, driven by a repressive vision of collective rebirth that challenges bourgeois institutional and cultural power while re-entrenching economic and social hierarchies. Those specific to North America, North American settler colonialist fascist movements include white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, ableism, indigenous dispossession, and capital accumulation. So then after working on some of the aspects of the three-way fight, which I'm actually going to close with, so I'm going to jump forward for a second, I look at the work of Rancière, and I use his work to argue that far-right movements are not politics and are not worthy of the respect we tend to accord to political movements that we describe as political. I argue that they are parapolitical, and so in that specific meaning of that term from Rancière is that their politics is specifically crafted to represent emancipatory politics as merely being the special interests of particular groups. And so in that way, they try to present Black Lives Matter or Indigenous resurgence or various other things as special interests, of which white supremacy is a special interest like others. The only difference in their theory being that, in fact, white people are now oppressed relative to all the other groups that get affirmative action. It's total bullshit. The key is to make a name, like to put a name to it so that we can understand what they're doing. So it's a parapolitical move. Instead of saying, look, these are massive structural challenges to North American settler colonialism, they deny that's what's at stake. Instead, they say, oh yeah, they're just special interests. Like we're looking for special interests. And it's pretty handy because, you know, you get sort of liberal critics that think about this stuff in those terms, and they tend to flounder on those details, and they get confused, and they they fall for all the traps of bad faith that Sartre describes in Anti-Semite and Jew. And then I also describe how we need to consider these far-right movements as and fascist movements as paramilitary groups, and of course need to be fought and through physical confrontation and other techniques. We could call them, in the words that I don't use in the book, but you could draw from the book, that it would be something, I would say something like parapolice, in the sense that they're looking for re-entrenching forms of oppression that in fact things like policing are already putting in place. In this sense, I use Rancière to update something from Sartre that I quote in the book, and that I also will read right here. It's right at the beginning of Anti-Semite and Jew. Sartre says, quote, "I refuse to characterize as opinion a doctrine that is aimed directly at particular persons and seeks to suppress their rights or exterminate them, and thus anti-Semitism does not fall within the category of ideas protected by the right of free opinion." And all I'm doing is taking that quote from Sartre and sort of using Rancière to make it writ large a political principle, because there's ways where Sartre kind of lapses into kind of appealing to liberal anti-fascist tendencies in that particular book. And then I dedicate a substantial amount of time in chapter 2 to the work of Beauvoir and Ethics of Ambiguity, which I think is an excellent book that hasn't gotten the kind of reception it's needed over the years. And I talk about some of the reasons why that's the case in the book. So if you're interested, you can go in there. I don't have to reiterate all that here. And for our purposes, aside from, I also talk quite a bit why I think she's making an important intervention in existentialism. But here I'm just going to talk about two key things for our discussion. First, there's an extensive criticism in the work of Beauvoir about criticisms of liberal anti-fascism as I reconstruct it. So the first is to say that they're wrong about so-called free speech. And they believe that in liberal anti-fascists, in sort of treating fascist ideas according to this metaphor of the marketplace of ideas, and confronting them as if it's a discursive kind of argument where you can win out with the better arguments. Beauvoir actually tracks a series of liberal and illiberal arguments that far right uses, largely to get legitimated by the process of debate, and the content doesn't matter. In fact, all they want to, as Sartre says, all they want to do is avoid looking bad. So as long as they come off as not looking ridiculous, it's a win because they're getting normalized by this kinds of discussion. So Beauvoir talks about the same thing, the representation of things like anti-racism as representing only particular interests. There are, arguments about trying to engage people with essentialist arguments about domination, for instance. And then there's those that are set up with sort of zero-sum accounts of rights. And all those things allow them to sort of throw their ideas out into there. And by being engaged in debate, they're legitimated through this process. And Beauvoir points out, in fact, that largely all that is just as Sartre says, techniques of intimidation intimidation and harassment of marginalized communities who aren't getting the voice in these kinds of discussions. And so she's really aiming that at philosophy, because at one point she refers to that basically being one of the prerogatives of critical thought is to try to engage that. And I view that as sort of the kind of Kantian vibe, which if you've read Rawls, you kind of know how this whole thing would work in all this. Second, and the part that I think is extremely important for our purposes, that especially for my work going forward, is Beauvoir is really good for showing the bad faith that liberal anti-fascism is in about violence. And I think this is the most important, because liberal anti-fascists, along with this marketplace of ideas, which doesn't really work, also don't have any good, clear tactical or strategic thinking about fighting the far right that doesn't really default or doesn't really do much except for sort of quietly default to hoping that state power intervenes. It's the kind of philosophy of a sternly worded letter and hope that the authorities intervene if things get out of hand. And what I argue is that this is basically in bad faith. It allows them to present themselves as representing a non-violent position, when really what they're doing is sort of allowing the state or state power or the police to do that kind of work. And I walk through a lot of this to say there's arguments in Beauvoir's Eye for an Eye to sort of de-objectify the idea that the state or state power is objective right or neutral. And that in fact, one of the major arguments for militant anti-fascism is that it views both the police and the far right as two things that they've got to fight. And that's really important, because if you're recruiting out of marginalized, I mean, like, you know, there's a big picture of militant anti-fascism as being very white, and I'm just going to roll from that assumption, even though I think it's incorrect in a lot of ways. You know, white anti-fascists are recruiting in marginalized communities that may get face more impingement from police action. Is that if you just go, oh yeah, we're going to work with the cops here too, in fact, you're excluding these people from this, because they're going to say, hold on here, the relationship between our community and the police is a hostile antagonism. And so why would I work with you? Because all you're going to do is then sort of pull us back within the ambit of police power. And so I think it's really important that militant anti-fascism continues to foreground the fact that state power is not an ally in this. And I think we can see that play out throughout the summer of 2020, especially in the fall of 2020. And then finally, in that relationship, this speaks to the last thing that I'm going to talk about, is one thing I want to highlight. It's very short in the book, and I really think it deserves more attention, is that there's also embedded in this is a philosophy of community self-defense. And so I'm going to talk quickly about that. The first is the typical idea of self-defense that we run with is one that has continuity with police power or policing or state power. And here's the basic idea that undergirds it. It's an individual's natural or state-sanctioned right to protect themselves, their family, or property. And that's a key issue in this, because this is really big in the way that self-defense cases play out when it's a white defendant accused of using a self-defense excuse to try to dodge stronger charges. Is very commonly, it's the perception of threat to property. In fact, you see this in Canadian law quite frequently as well in the Gerald Stanley case. It's a continuity of the protection of these things in the absence of state protection, and the idea that state protection intervenes. The philosophy of community self-defense, as I see it, breaks with this continuity and is organized in the acknowledgement of this antagonism between police and these communities, organized around protecting spaces of solidarity and the communities of the marginalized or the oppressed. So in this idea, community, there's a couple other aspects that are really important to modernize the concept if we're working with community self-defense as elaborated, where I think it ought to be elaborated from is the militant work coming out in 1960s civil rights movements. So Deacons of Defense, Robert F. Williams, the Crusader, Malcolm X, all these figures. The key out of this is that there's a way to read this where you can believe it to be geographically or sociologically bounded to certain communities. And that's what I want to upset. And in fact, it comes out of Robert F. Williams' own work to upset these kinds of premises or presuppositions. So the first is coming even out of Williams, is to say community self-defense is not geographically bounded to some neighborhoods and not others. And nor does it respect the public-private distinction. There's very commonly the idea that it's something you can use in the private communities, but in fact, Robert F. Williams and his groups and the Deacons of Defense used it in public spaces. And that's what's really important. Same with the Panthers as well. The next point is community self-defense is not grounded on homogenous, sociologically identifiable groups. And so we don't want to say it rests on the right of predetermined, marginalized, or oppressed groups, because these groups, one of the keys of revolutionary philosophical thought is the process of revolution changes people in the process. And so to say it only applies to pre-identifiable groups that we can recognize that can't change in the process is in fact counter-revolutionary. And so I reject that idea. Look, it can come out of these communities, but these communities change, lines of solidarity are built, and this modifies practice as time goes on. And then finally, community self-defense is morally legitimated on the basis of building more egalitarian communities than those presently existing, and politically empowering those who are marginalized and oppressed than all those avenues available through social institutions. And that is another reason why, in fact, it's morally legitimate to do this. And I view more militant anti-fascism to be legitimated on this basis. I'm going to stop here because I don't want to run long. I'm just going to say one last thing. Chapter 5 is dedicated to a long analysis of settler colonialism and its relationship to fascism and militant anti-fascism. And it's an extremely important part of the book. I don't want to run long. I really urge readers, my own view, it was an aspect that really grew out of the analysis, and it was demanded by the analysis. I didn't plan for it to originally be in the book, but I really think it's one of the most important chapters out of the book. But it would require, in its own way, a lot of unpacking. When Josh and I exchange questions, we've already seen them, so I'm going to give this away. I'm going to be able to talk about this a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is put that aside for now, and we're going to come back to it after Josh and I have both spoken. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the questions.
All right, thank you, Devin. Your book sounds really exciting, and I'm really excited to hear more when you exchange some questions and have a discussion with Josh. So I just want to remind the audience that you can ask a question or leave a comment. You can ask Devin to elaborate on further points. We will collect these questions and comments and present them or answer them later on after Josh and Devin have an exchange. But again, the Q&A button is at the bottom center of your Zoom window. Click it, fill it out, click submit. We'll get to it later on. So we also encourage people to purchase this book by Devin. Now, there are two ways to purchase the book that we recommend. Depending on where you are located, we'll tell you where to purchase the book from. If you are in the Vancouver area, you can purchase the book in person at one of the sponsors, People's Co-op Bookstore. And you can learn more at their website, peoplescoopbookstore.com. By the way, while Josh and Devin have an exchange, I'll be putting links into the chat box for you all to save, so you can visit either the sponsors or other places to purchase the books, or follow people on Twitter. Now, for anyone outside of the Vancouver area, if you want to purchase this book, especially the international listeners, you can find the book at leftwingbooks.net, published by Kursplebedeb, or a simple internet search, Left Wing Books or Kursplebedeb, or the book itself would suffice. We do encourage folks to purchase straight from leftwingbooks.net as opposed to Amazon, so everyone involved in the publication of this book benefits, and not a third-party corporation who has no interest in the ideas of this book. We also encourage the audience to follow People's Co-op Bookstore and Devin on Twitter. Now you can follow People's Co-op on Twitter at Co-op Books, at Co-op Books. And then you can follow Devin on Twitter at Devin Z Shaw, at Devin Z Shaw. Okay, now let's move on to our next featured speaker, which is J. Moufawad-Paul. Instead of describing him, we're going to play a short video, a biographical video, and we'll have Josh speak right afterwards. J. Moufawad-Paul lives in Toronto and works as contract faculty at York University, where he received his PhD in philosophy. Within the past decade, he has published numerous articles and books regarding revolutionary theory and Maoism, including The Communist Necessity, Continuity and Rupture, Austerity Apparatus, and Critique of Maoist Reason. And now and then, he blogs at MLM Mayhem. In his presentation today, he'll be speaking about his book, Demarcation and Demystification, Philosophy and Its Limits. Marx once declared the philosophers have only interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. Demarcation and Demystification examines the ways in which a radical practice of philosophy is possible under the aegis of Marx's 11th thesis, arguing that philosophy's radicality is discovered by understanding that it can only ever interpret the world, that social transformation lies beyond the sphere of its operations. All right, let's welcome J. Moufawad-Paul.
Hi, everybody. I mean, it's great being here. Well, I'd probably add to just Will's saying about Devin's book and where you can buy it. It also can be bought in Toronto at Another Story, where mine is as well. For people that are in Toronto as well, they've ordered in a number of copies. So I feel I should mention that too. Okay, so I mean, it's great being part of this and following Devin. I'm gonna say a few things about my book and then read a passage, which is typical of these kinds of things. Okay, so this book, I mean, like Devin's book came out this year. Mine came out actually almost an entire year ago. It came out in December 2019. And I had intended to organize a launch in spring 2020, but the pandemic hit. And at that time, I wasn't thinking about virtual launches. I'm not sure a lot of people were at the beginning of there because we weren't sure what to do. And then all this stuff started happening. People started doing all these virtual things. So yeah, so mine's like maybe a lot less timely. I mean, in the interim of writing it between then and now, I was lucky enough to have some good podcast discussions about the book with Revolutionary Left Radio and Manifesting, but I never got the chance to have a proper launch. And also, I guess, even though it's been a year that I haven't released this, since it's more abstract than most of what I've published to date, the fact that I'm launching it a year later maybe doesn't matter too much. I mean, here's like a dumb philosophy joke is that, Althusser once claimed that philosophy has no history. And since this book is about the meaning of philosophy, then I guess it also doesn't have to worry about history. It can be released now without feeling out of date. Anyhow, so I'm honored to be doing the launch with Devin's book. And it's kind of funny, actually, because we both have blurbs on each other's books on the back. So we both blurbed each other's books. We've both read them. Actually, I reread Devin's a second time for this launch. I know he reread mine a second time as well. So in some ways, it seems appropriate that we're doing this as a joint launch because of this shared blurbing, and we've both seen each other's projects in different stages. At first glance, though, they seem quite different. I mean, mine is just about like the practice of radical philosophy, and there's much more political immediacy, and I would argue a timely importance to Devin's book than mine. But I do believe they're driven by the same sensibility of a ruthless criticism of all that exists. So demarcation and demystification was the result of years of thinking and writing in my discipline. The earliest draft was finished a year after I defended my dissertation in 2010. And after that, it kept developing as I was writing The Communist Necessity and Continuity and Rupture. I mean, I kept pushing it ahead and refining it. And I mainly, one of the things I was about ready to get it ready for publication, but then I pushed it ahead again because I wanted to publish Methods Devour Themselves with Benjamin Sivung Kao. And, actually part of the reason I wrote Methods with B was because my final draft of Demarcation and Demystification began with an analogy from one of B's stories. And I found that interesting in and of itself to explore in just like a book with her, right? And so it spiraled into that. I did that first, push Demarcation and Demystification further back, and then eventually it came out at the end of 2019. But in many ways, despite all the books that that came out before this one came out of mine, Demarcation and Demystification is kind of the DNA of my philosophical method. I guess it's kind of the revelation of the person behind the curtain. In this book, I really wanted to dig down and think what it means to practice philosophy as a materialist, and what it means to practice philosophy as a militant, and how we can think philosophy in the ruins of the European Enlightenment project. And I say ruins of the Enlightenment project to juxtapose how I think of modernity and the so-called Enlightenment in comparison with those reactionaries who have facile, Eurocentric, and ahistorical interpretations of that event. Rebecca Comey, in a quotation I used to preface the 5th chapter of this book, likened modernity to the crumbling ruins of Carthage. The point here is that there is something the European Enlightenment has inscribed in thought, something it has done for humanity, but at the same time, this is all ruinous and terribly compromised. It is built upon all that it has ruined, just as Rome was built upon the ruins of North African Carthage and has become its own ruins. And so we get the initiation of scientific sequences that are undeniable because they produce real world effects, and the distillation of instruments we all use and are using right now to have this discussion, but they are bound up in social relations that are utterly terrible and predatory. And they also exist because of knowledge is stolen through colonial conquest. So in any case, in this context, I'm just giving that kind of paint, and this is the stuff that I talk about in the book too. Marxism stands out as the most radical critique of the state of affairs, a modernity that is critical of modernity, to quote Samir Amin, and a critique of all philosophies that would be content with sifting through the ruins and pretending that there was a perfect and unbroken legacy from ancient Greece to the present. There's something Marxism does to philosophy while also engaging with a theoretical train of science that is historically singular. And yes, its singularity has to do with place and time. And yes, it is compromised by the details of this place and time, but all sciences are compromised by social relations. And it is in fact Marxism which first told us that this was the case. So like I said last week, I had this talk last week at the University of Philippines at their Contend conference. I said that there's no theory that has proven itself more antagonistic to the state of affairs than Marxism. And this is undeniable based on like the real world massive revolutions that have terrified business as usual, imperialism and capitalism. So with this in mind, how do we think philosophy? And that's the broad thing. How do we think philosophy in this context? And that's the point of demarcation and demystification. So with that kind of general summary, I'm going to read a passage that I think can just like summarizes what the book's about and its general kind of conceptions better than me just, yapping on about it. So let me just find the passage here. And this is a passage in the introduction or the preface, I'm not sure, prologue. And it's not the beginning of the prologue, but kind of the second section of it. Defining philosophy has always been a philosophical conceit. Philosophers often treat their discipline as an object of study and are perhaps too obsessed with such an inward turning investigation. While part of this obsession is in part due to a common confusion over the meaning of philosophy evinced by new university students and laypersons who assume, based on a common sense understanding, that to practice philosophy is simply to express one's personal beliefs and opinions about existence, it is also a fact that treating philosophy itself as an object of study is a tendency that arises from the discipline's most basic logic, to locate a train of study and attempt to force meaning. As Wittgenstein wrote in the Tractatus, philosophy aims at the logical clarification of thoughts. And so it is understandable that philosophers would also attempt to clarify their thoughts on the meaning of philosophy itself. Hence, we should not be surprised when we encounter entire libraries of books written by famous philosophers devoted to providing a definition of their discipline. If the task of finding a definition of philosophy in general has resulted in an avalanche of scholarship, the task of finding a definition of philosophy in the shadow of Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, where we are told that philosophy has interpreted the world, but the point is to change it, has produced its own difficulties and debates. Regardless of one's particular thoughts on Marx's project, the influence of Marxism upon philosophy as a whole is undeniable. It has indeed cast a shadow across the entire field. Although Marx's influence is particularly significant in the realm of social philosophy, even amongst those radical theorists who begin by rejecting its totalizing narrative, it has also provoked the engagement of epistemologists, logicians, and philosophers of science. Moreover, those philosophers utterly opposed to all forms of Marxist politics often become invested in dismissing Marx and Marxism, falling over themselves to cleanse the respectable field of political philosophy from the shadow of Marxism. While some might argue that with the collapse of actually existing socialism and capitalism's so-called end of history, Marxism's influence is no longer significant, this fails to recognize that the line Marx drew through philosophy, the division of interpretation and transformation, may in fact be as salient and undeniable as earlier lines drawn by the first philosophers, by heretical theorists such as Ibn Khaldun, or by the new scientists of the European Enlightenment. There are moments when philosophical practice was transformed, and I will argue that the emergence of Marxism represents its most apocalyptic transformation. Simply assuming that Marxism has been influential and that the questions it posed for philosophy remain significant does little to answer the more important question: what is the meaning of the shadow it casts upon the entirety of philosophical practice, if it indeed casts such a shadow? And how can we understand the meaning of philosophy, both Marxist and non-Marxist, within its twilight? If understanding the meaning of philosophy in general has been a problem for the entire history of philosophy, figuring out the meaning of its Marxist instantiation is similarly troublesome, since Marxists also cannot decide on a definition of Marxist philosophy. Indeed, the history of Marxism, from its most orthodox to its most heterodox variants, is filled with statements regarding philosophy and its relationship to Marxism. As we shall examine, some of these statements have been quite formulaic, whereas others have been rather vague. This book, then, exists as an attempt to make sense of the meaning of philosophy in general through the lens of the meaning of Marxist philosophy in particular. The former concern is guided by the latter, since we cannot escape the fact that our general definitions are mediated by our political fidelity. Even this claim is essentially Marxist, one that will most probably be rejected by other philosophers whose commitments are at odds with the politics of this book. In any case, political commitment aside, this book will not be a typical "what is philosophy" or even a "what is Marxist philosophy" treatise. Rather, this project is guided by two questions. One, what is philosophy's relationship to radical theory and practice? Two, what does it mean to radically practice philosophy? My aim is not merely to define philosophy in general and Marxist philosophy in particular, but to do so in a manner that clarifies a radical intervention upon social theory and revolutionary practice. Philosophy, therefore, in the shadow of the 11th thesis. Drawing lines of demarcation is useful for both thinking and for what Althusser called theoretical practice. I'm not primarily concerned with teaching laypersons about what philosophers do, or even clarifying my chosen disciplinary field for others within this field, since this would result in an introductory or beginner's book that would have no practical application beyond disciplinary definition. Instead, by proposing a schism between philosophy and theory, and thus putting philosophy in its place, the aim is to force questions about what it means to engage with social theory and radical practice. How then should we understand a multiplicity of social theories, as well as the historical unfolding of critical thought, in relationship to innumerable rebellions and radical rejections of oppression, exploitation, normative discourses, and ideological hegemony? Those of us who are interested in making sense of any and all phenomena according to a radical theoretical practice often find ourselves dizzied by myriad and contradictory social theories. The temptation is to cherry pick from disparate theoretical constellations in the hope that radical eclecticism will force meaning. Hence, a radical theoretical practice may indeed require clarity. Moreover, I'm also interested in producing such clarity by forcing a confrontation between radical social theory and revolutionary practice, the gap between academic theory and revolutionary theory, and the fact that many enamored by the former might be unaware of the latter, and vice versa, is a dissonant space that needs to be bridged. Contemporary social theory may teach us something about revolutionary movements, but these movements should also teach us something about social theory and how theory relates to all types of social practice, from revolutionary practice itself, to social struggles, to all forms of human production and creation, to even intellectual and artistic critique. An understanding of this gap will deepen our understanding of theory and practice, as well as theoretical practice, and thus spills beyond a mere definition of philosophy. Therefore, while I believe in the importance of social theory, I also do not hold that academic studies should be treated as identical to revolutionary politics. Rather, I would argue that the best works of social theory, as well as scientific, artistic, and literary praxis, emerge from sites of struggle and what some Marxists call a concrete analysis of a concrete situation. That is, engagement with actual revolutionary practice and concrete instances of class struggle, broadly understood, produces better radical theory, as well as better radical theorists, political economists, historians, scientists, artists, and especially philosophers. And that's where I'll leave my reading of the book. And actually, yeah, I'm going to keep my presentation actually just to that level, like kind of short and sweet, with the book describing it and that. And I think with that, I really want to move on to the part of the discussion where we start exchanging questions between myself and Devin. So I have a question prepared for Devin. I'm going to wait because I think Will is going to spotlight both of us here or something.
There you go. It should be both of you all on right now.
Is it? Or is it both of us? I think I'm just seeing you, Will, on this. We're at the top still.
It is on my end.
Okay. I'm just going to assume other people can see it too. We'll see. Let me see if there's anyone says anything in the chat about that. I don't know. I'll just go on with my question. If we see something saying that it's like not spotlighted on us, I guess we can kind of fix that, right?
Yeah, but I could play around with this just real quick. So like Devin's on now.
I'm getting text saying from people I know saying I can see both. Okay, so it's working.
All right.
Okay. So yeah, I have this question prepared for Devin. As I mentioned earlier before, the one thing about this is that we had both read each other's books at various stages ahead of time, and then we both reread the hard copies. I mean, I was really happy to read. I got the hard copy here. I was really happy to receive my copy and reread it because I better retain information. Maybe it's a show of my age or stuff, but I don't retain information very well from electronic texts. I need to have that dead tree copy that I can like mark up all the time and write notes in. And so, yeah, I was good to do that. And so I have a question for Devin first, and so that I wrote out and that he can answer, and I look forward for his answer. So, just a second here. One of the strengths of philosophy of anti-fascism, at least to my mind, is that it links resurgent fascism in places like the US and Canada to settler colonialism and the race regimes generated by settler colonialism. In this way, following César and Du Bois, you emphasize that the manifestation of fascism or far-right movements are not anachronistic to these social formations, but generated by their internal logic. You also link this to Du Bois's notion of the public and psychological wage of whiteness. You expand on Du Bois's notion by referring to whiteness as signifying, quote, the right to title, sovereignty, and ownership, end quote. One thing I've noticed when it comes to Canadian settlerism is that Canadians can pat themselves on the back as being tolerant and not racist, but then the ugliest and most violent forms of racism and fascist or fascist adjacent behaviors will manifest if and when the colonized resist in ways that make everyday settler business as usual, even the slightest bit uncomfortable. I'm thinking here of how Kanesatake in 1990 put up barricades to stop the annexation of their community cemetery and the settlers in Oka, who had got along with the Mohawk community before that, turned into the most violent white supremacists almost overnight. or the settler fishers in Nova Scotia who just recently have been burning Indigenous fisheries and destroying their livelihood simply because the colonized stood up for their treaty-protected rights. These are situations in which the presumed right to title, sovereignty, and ownership of whiteness, or the settler common sense, if you will, is challenged and the fascist creep manifests. Can you expand on this in relation to your thesis in the last chapter, that far-right movements are system loyal when they perceive that the entitlements of white supremacy can be advanced within settler colonial institutions, and they become insurrectionary when they perceive that these entitlements cannot be thus advanced?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So that touches on one of the key things of chapter 5. So it's about the relationship in settler colonialism in North America. And so to answer your question, it comes in a couple parts, because I say that radical action and militant anti-fascism and revolutionary thought have to think about settler state hegemony and how it's constructed. And that's a dialectic that mediates between liberal institutions and social forces of white supremacy. And I mean that in a broad historical sense, because there's a lot of ways in which, when you look through, I mean it in a broad historical sense in two ways, is that settler colonialism is ongoing. At the same time, we want to look at the history of, there's this kind of settler colonial vigilantism, or, they're called citizen deputies or shock troops or various other things by various writers, as people actually pushing the frontier, rather than, we have this idea like the American expansion or Canadian expansion was conducted by armed forces that were like uniformed armed forces or something like this. And you go, oh yeah, well, that's state power. Well, there's also this aspect of the dialectic where, I really like Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz for pointing this out. Different spots where settlers ran off to land that wasn't theirs and used all kinds of violence to do it. And then the US comes in and says, it's time to do a treaty. We're the peacekeepers here. And that there's a dialectic between that. And part of that's what led me to say, let's observe a kind of general rule of understanding settler colonialism as, settlers and the far right come out of that. The far right comes out of that settler base, and they go along with settler institutions when they're advantaged by them. And that's why you could say the KKK, for instance, could be seen as pretty readily system loyal in the 1960s, but starting in the early 1970s starts to be system oppositional. And there's some nuance to this that I learned about doing some research this summer. One of the great ways that I think this really plays out is in some of your examples there. The one I like to use from this year actually precedes the pandemic of settlers in Edmonton and various other places dismantling barricades during the Wet'suwet'en and Solidarity moments. And this had all the elements that are really interesting to this, because it helps train us about the relationship between these groups and police as well. In Edmonton, there's video of them dismantling this barricade that's on a railroad track, while the RCMP or local police looks on. So they're just standing there chilling, doing what police do, which is let them get away with doing that stuff. And they're dismantling this, and there's a relationship between the settler state and these far right people in the basic coordinates of the settler state's sort of liberal ambit. And I mean that in terms of liberalism or its regular rule. And it's out of that kind of entitlement that, in fact, these far right groups kind of spring as a kind of insurgent version of this that's really seeking to re-entrench all the kinds of things they feel or they perceive are slipping away from them. And so that's one of the key aspects to that. I'm going to try and keep that short. That doesn't answer all the cases. There's one other aspect I actually think is really important before I stop, is down in the US this summer and fall, I think we saw, this challenged my own view. I look a lot at system loyal and system opposition in philosophy of anti-fascism. And I think today I'd revise that to talk a little bit more about, to clarify, talking about system opposition and system loyalty as a kind of inside-outside discourse, and look at system opposition sometimes more in terms of actual organizational capacity, because you could see these different tendencies playing out. The way the state responded to the Boogaloo Boys, for instance, who they perceived to be much more immediately dangerous, got a lot of state power coming down on them. Whereas the vigilante groups that kind of started waving Trump flags around and stuff like this, they got a lot more leeway and built a lot of alliances with local police. And I wrote about that just because I wanted to scold, all the liberal anti-fascists out there who were congratulating themselves for voting fascism out. And it's like, you didn't change anything about the social relationships that all got built this year, and you don't have a good plan for confronting them after this. So those would be some of the aspects I would try to highlight out of your question. Now, for you, Josh, so I really appreciate, and I'm glad that these books are sort of paired together, even though it would seem like there's not a strong connection from them. I really appreciate Demarcation and Demystification. There are certainly aspects of it where I read it and I'm like, I wish I would have phrased something you said out of that in my own book that would have made it less full of circumlocutions about trying to get at what I was trying to do with philosophy. I'm going to focus on one particular part. Is I think it's really important how you talk about how clarification in relationship to class struggle is important. And it changes the question of philosophy from being something like, and you and I both know continental philosophy is very heavy on this particular aspect of, the exegesis of the text as a kind of clarification. And I think what's really important is you're steeped in that tradition, and so am I. But the question becomes of clarification, what can this do to clarify the terrain of struggle? And so it's helpful because instead of saying, and I've seen people do talks like this, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, where they go, well, what does my dude say about this? As if that's a clarification because they're staked out with their dude. You're saying, well, what in philosophy overall, how can it clarify a particular terrain of struggle, which of course isn't just centered on the my dude phenomenon, like what does Latour say about this? Well, who gives a fuck, actually? But that's why I use Latour for this particular one. But there's one question I do have that I think is serious, that can't be reduced to clarification, is that I think that if we go back and pull out to the bigger picture of philosophy, that philosophy should have a role in, and I think your book can do this, a role in the conceptual translation across Western canon and non-Western traditions. And we could think of it this way. There's a definite Anglo-Saxon or Eurocentric chauvinist tendency in academic philosophy that dismisses non-Western approaches. And, I don't need to list a bunch of people, it's out there. And if this is true, that philosophy as a discipline is a battleground for the fight against colonialism, then translation, from my view, then would serve to allow cross-tradition fluency in an anti-colonial struggle. Translation could be a form of building solidarity by underlining commonalities and offering a common point of departure or transformation. Of course, not through philosophy, but transformation through social struggle. And even if we might expect that the official canon would become bourgeois on patterns of other national academies, this types of translation and exchange could be used to anticipate this aspect of continued struggle. And I ask this because I tried to do some of this in chapter 5 of my book, shifting between anti-fascism, existentialism, the Black radical tradition as represented by Du Bois, and indigenous political thought in my book, actually represented quite a bit through Arthur Manuel.
Okay, I mean, yeah, it's a big question. I mean, the easy pat answer, and I could just be like, that's it. I could just say, well, conceptual translation, that's just a form of clarification. But, it deserves more than that because you have a lot in there. I mean, so to say like how, I mean, I want to, maybe start by saying how it's a form of clarification in the broad sense when I talk about clarification. And in the book, I have this whole thing where I talk about clarification in these patterns of demarcation and demystification, right? And so I think that this is in there implicitly in what I talk about. This is a great kind of adjacent or connected question to it. So I want to begin by maybe saying how conceptual translation in general is a form of clarification, and then maybe expanding out from there to a number of the other bigger and actually more concrete aspects of your question. So I guess I'd say that in a simple sense, right, translation, like what we know of just translation in general, right? What translation does, if we just think of what translation is it clarifies the meaning of something in one conceptual register for another conceptual register. So when something in one language is translated into another, then in that sense, right, what was once unclear for those who did not speak the first language becomes clear according to the words and grammar with which they are familiar. Actually, in the fourth chapter of my book, And that's the chapter that is actually about philosophy and clarity. I begin with this quotation from Lukács, philosophy is the urge to be at home everywhere. And with that in mind, it's like to become familiar with something unfamiliar so that you feel at home understanding it is the clarity that comes with translation. So in this sense, to clarify is to render something that was once opaque understandable. But so that's the short answer, and that's definitely not enough. Because if we start thinking about, in the sense that I want people to understand clarification and demarcation and demystification, and especially if you understand clarification in the sense that you asked, Devin, as a practice of translation, I think we can also say that familiarization is one aspect, but defamiliarization is also important. And here, I don't mean the kind of defamiliarization that results in a collapse of clarity, or what in the book I call occulting the world or making it obscure and unknowable, but what takes notions that are so familiar, we treat them as common sense, and translates them into different terms so that they are revealed as alien and uncomfortable. So, examining ideological notions that are so familiar that they have become common sense and making them uncomfortable and unfamiliar clarifies the ideological processes that made them become familiar and comfortable to us in the first place. And you don't have to go very far to find these kind of notions that are just built into our understanding. Like a very simple one is the notions that so many of us, if we've been raised in, bourgeois society, right, the notions that selfishness and competition are essential to human nature. And these have been familiar to us and are something since we were children, right? And if we reveal the ideological basis of these notions and show how they shouldn't be treated with comfortable familiarity, we reveal their meaning. And part of this is translating them into other terms and notions and demystifying the history behind them. So with this in mind, if we do run, there's this other part, right? That we sometimes run up against identical terms that different philosophers use in different ways. So like for your book, right? I mean, you use Rancière's, you talk about Rancière's definition of politics. But we know, and we've had this discussion before, that, and we joke about that there's all these other philosophers that define politics differently and have that same word, right? So, you get Rancière sees politics and policing as opposed, but then you get like, say, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, who define politics in a completely pejorative sense that is connected to similarly spelled English words such as policing and policy. And, Rancière uses the French, but they have the shared Latin roots, so the same similarities. So once we hit this point about conceptual translation, it's not about general language translation, but it's about completely different meanings philosophers assign to their terms. But this is where, maybe brings me back to like my book and other things that I've said here is I've long maintained and this isn't just like many philosophers have pointed this out, right? And maybe this is also, you talk about, in continental philosophy, but I also have that heritage of my philosophy, like in my undergrad and about half of my grad school too, that came from analytic philosophy. So maybe this distinction that I'm really into is that, I like maintaining that the categories of name and concept are not the same. And I think it's important to think that, because a lot of confusion and lack of clarity and actually really bad philosophy comes from conflating these categories. Sometimes philosophers use the same terms or names to talk about very different concepts. And sometimes the same concept appears with different names, especially across different languages. And with this in mind, it's important to point out that there is in continental philosophy this way of like kind of conflating the name and concept that has resulted in a particular kind of Eurocentric language idealism. I think a lot of this is inherited from Heidegger, the Heideggerian tradition, and it results from trying to track the meaning of a concept through its etymological roots, where the deepest meaning of a concept that appears in a Western language can be discovered through the linguistical history of its name, particularly the meaning of the same name in Latin or Greek. And you find this kind of language idealism performed by philosophers like Agamben and Nancy. And you don't even have to, like, before we talk about the broader problems of it just being, let's find the real meaning of this concept because it has this name that has these roots in European language, right? Which has that Eurocentric problem. You don't even have to begin by thinking about that broader political Eurocentric problem to realize that this is a really silly notion of trying to figure out what something means. And the whole point is that if we tried to say that the meaning of some concept comes from the history of its name, then we'd also be led to say that the term atom in contemporary physics means the same as it meant for the atomists in ancient Greek society. But if you trace the meaning of that back to its original employment by the atomists, you're not going to learn a deep truth about particle physics, right? At all. It's not going to tell you anything. The concept is different. It shares the same name. There is some cultural and cosmetic relational facts regarding the historical choice of the name, but the concept is what we're looking at that's different. And more importantly, though, with that in mind, this conflation of name and concept prevents us from translating and clarifying conceptual content. So imagine thinking that the meanings, and this goes back to that Heideggerian tradition, like imagine thinking that the meaning of concepts such as equality or solidarity or communism could only be located in the roots of their Latin or Greek etymology. Like imagine the arrogance it takes to think that completely different language traditions, especially those most far from the Eurocentric linguistical construction, did not have the same concepts that use different names with different etymological histories with similar ruptures. And so I think this gets us to your last point about the importance of cross-tradition fluency. And I think this is accomplished by figuring out the conceptual ground that is shared, but that may not share the same names. And clarity is produced by emphasizing the shared ground through conceptual translation. And here it really is important to emphasize, and I've kind of been emphasizing it all along, right? That the Eurocentric and chauvinist tendency of mainstream Western philosophy to treat, non-Western philosophical traditions as being of less worth, if not worthless. I'm thinking here, and we've talked about it a number of times, right? And maybe a number of our listeners will know this, about the controversy around David Benatar's refusal to recognize. And David Benatar is this South African, Afrikaner, philosopher that teaches in South Africa in the philosophy department. And there's this controversy around his refusal to recognize, and he also it became quite clear in this refusal to recognize that he hadn't even read it, African philosophy, despite teaching at an African university. And that's kind of paradigmatic of this chauvinist ignorance you find in a lot of mainstream Western philosophy departments. And this is an inability to consider shared concepts, not to mention other and worthwhile concepts that could possibly be philosophically translated across traditions for the benefit of everyone. And the idea here that we cannot learn from and translate this conceptual content and get clear, use it for clarity and bring clarity to it and allow it to bring clarity to our notions. The idea that we can't learn and all this stuff from, say, for example, in the Benatar case, African philosophy, but that simultaneously we have something to learn from Plato or Aristotle is, if you really think about it, it's irrational, right? Irrational. So, I've been reading, Ajit's most recent collection that Foreign Languages Press put out. And in that one, he talks about how even the most recent Western intellectual, and this is a quote from him, easily summons Plato or Aristotle as living, relevant reference. And, and here, this is despite the fact that, again, quoting from him, Greek philosophy re-arrived in Europe through Arab philosophical schools. But this whole idea that these recent Western intellectuals can do this, but they go summon this kind of idea of Plato or Aristotle as living, but at the same time they largely treat other ancient philosophical traditions as either long dead or worthless. And in this sense, the only reason Benatar and people like Benatar think there is more to learn from the ancient Greeks, whose society was actually, like if you actually study ancient Greek society, was quite alien from our own. And that they think that they have more to learn from that, and that's a living tradition, than from traditions outside of the so-called Western canon is only proof of the normativity of the canon and the construction of a mythic and unbroken Europe, right? It's not a proof that their position that they can't learn anything from these other traditions is rational. Actually, all it does, that position they have, it just proves that they belong to a certain notion of normativity around a philosophical canon, right? And that belief is a position that militates against thought because it refuses to explore or think what it has a priori designated as unworthy of thinking. And it's also in the real world. It's also a position in the real world. It's also a position that pushes the already marginalized out of philosophy departments. And as an aside here, Matteo and Dante's recent interview with Revolutionary Voices, and I think Matteo's watching this. I saw him on the the list of attendees, and he had a really great interview with Will's Revolutionary Voices podcast, and it's worth listening to because he talks about all of this as part of the overall class outlook of mainstream academic philosophy that really functions to exclude and discipline its discontents. In any case, to wrap this up, philosophy, which I've argued always tails theory, is completely impoverished if it remains only within the acceptable Eurocentric canon. But it can be universalist in a real sense, not pseudo-universalist in the sense peddled by the ethnocentric canon, by engaging honestly with other cultural traditions, finding common conceptual grounds, using this kind of idea of conceptual translation to bring clarity and to learn. And I think this is how we grow as thinkers. And I will leave my question at that. Okay, I think those are our questions, and we can go into a Q&A period now.
Yeah, 1 second though. So we do have some questions, and to give you all time to read those questions, I will play a video of Devin, which I made a hiccup earlier. It should have been played earlier, but I'll have the audience watch that now. But it also give time for people to write a question if they want to as well. But let's play this video real quick, and then we'll jump into the Q&A section, which is the final section of tonight's program. Devin Zane Shaw teaches philosophy at Douglas College in British Columbia. He is the author of 3 books, including Philosophy of Antifascism and Egalitarian Moments from Descartes to Rancière, and a recent pamphlet on solidarity movements and indigenous struggles, The Politics of the Blockade. He is co-editor with LaRose Paris and Storm Heater of the Living Existentialism series published by Rowman and Littlefield. Today he'll be talking about philosophy of anti-fascism, punching Nazis and fighting white supremacy. He argues that to fight fascist mobilization, contemporary movements must find a diversity of tactics more useful than principled nonviolence. Anti-fascism must also focus on the systemic causes of the re-emergence of fascism, and thus must fight capital accumulation and the underlying white supremacism. Providing incisive interpretations of existentialism, the Black radical tradition, and indigenous political thought, he makes the case for organizing a broader militant movement against fascism. Alrighty then, let me bring, let's see, Josh and Devin to the spotlight. And if you want to just take it away and start answering the questions, I guess we could just do that.
Yeah. I've got a couple. The first couple were about, they're about sort of looking at the composition of settler colonialism. So one of them asks about, can we talk about a concept such as settler fascism? And this is a question that's about, it says, understanding the involvement of non-white people with fascist united fronts in North America. And then the other one talks about the relationship about anti-imperialism and xenophobia in these. I'm not going to answer both of these in particular, but I'm going to just try and kind of point to how I tried to work out some of this. There's been, I've been looking a lot at the States, and I'm isolated from the States and Canada at the moment. So I've been conversing with some organizers and theorists and stuff about this. One of the big things has been the discussion of what do you make of non-white people with fascist groups or far right groups right now? What's the relationship to xenophobia? And in these issues, I would say there's no consensus amongst this. Like, for instance, I've had some back and forth with Don Hammerquist, who's one of the authors who is in Confronting Fascism, which I work a lot with in my book. And I've been able to talk to him a little bit and a little bit with Matthew Lyons and a few people in the Three-Way Fight stuff that comes out of confronting fascism, and it's been great to be able to talk to them about it, and some other people they know and some people I know. And there's not a real, amongst us, we could say, just as an example, we're all opinionated and there's no consensus amongst us about kind of how to look at it. So I'll just kind of say where I'm looking at it in this particular way is I do think xenophobia plays an important part. There's a historical aspect that I certainly didn't cover in my book that needs covering about this, about non-white people, like for instance in the Proud Boys. There's been some debate. Well, look, are we talking about this as a male supremacist movement? Or I've been defending the view that we're looking at whiteness as being something that's more malleable. As what we could be looking at is, as my argument, is in Darkwater, W.E.B. Du Bois talks a lot about how there were non-white groups we would now view as ethnic groups we would now view as white, that weren't considered, like Irish, Slavic peoples, Jewish people, lots of other people. And one way that Du Bois looks at it is that there are aspects where their whiteness is purchased at coalescing around anti-blackness. That's what Du Bois is looking at. And for instance, with other groups, and I've talked to people that do like sociology up here in Canada about this as well. And that can be just, they'll immigrate to the United States and go right out to the settler frontier. And they shape a kind of idea of settler identity as the national identity. Canadianism is, to some of these people that went straight out to the frontier, this settler ideology of working the hostile land or whatever in Saskatchewan. So there's a lot going on there that I think it's it's hard to sort of make a simple theory out of it, in the sense that I'd like to look at the complexity. One other thing I've been looking at recently as well is the existence of far-right Hindu movements in North America that kind of just pick up the kind of nationalism, fascism, and far-right elements out of Indian society, and they're sort of fighting that out in North America. In a way that doesn't necessarily reference the kind of way we understand supremacist movements in North America. Like it's immigrated over here, and there's people doing it. There's people doing the supremacist sort of things in Vancouver, for example, that have been documented, and it's kind of just done on some very straightforward terms that won't look immediately obvious to North Americans at first. And one thing I've been looking at is trying to understand some of that stuff. So I know that's not exactly helpful, but we could try and say that we're looking at something where this is in the process of movement, motion, and change, where I would at least say the first hypothesis is to try to say with something like the Proud Boys is that this is, if there are people or from ethnic groups we consider to be non-white, that we could view this as a kind of a malleable reformation of whiteness around, violence or this kind of mobilization, which can still backfire against them. There was a move recently where one of the Proud Boys decided he was done with the leadership of Enrique Tarrio, and that he wanted to go back to the more explicitly white supremacist stuff, and that happened right before they were trying to do some of their mass rallies. And so, that can be revoked and changed very quickly.
Okay, I guess I'm going to unmute since I'll take a shot now. I have one question here that asks, is there any possibility of freedom in non-clarity? I think this might speak to more what I have to actually explain about why I use the term clarity and things like that. I'm not sure what the question is getting at. I'm not talking about clarity as like a type of being or being in the world or something like that. In fact, I tend to, one of the things in this book is I tend to reject these kind of, or reject, try to steer away from these grand ontological claims about being and something like that. Now, why do I use, when I mean clarity, I'm not talking about a state of like, I don't know, clarifying your life or being clear about the world or having that. I'm talking about what philosophy does, right? I mean, philosophy, one of the things I argue is that once you strip philosophy of all its grand pretensions, right? And it's like, from the very beginning of like ancient stuff, and even now people see philosophy as like this thing that, oh, it's the queen of the sciences, way back, or oh, it's, it has this, um, it does this study of being that can reveal the scaffolding behind reality and all this shit that is accumulated since like the very first philosophers, and a lot of this kind of mystified stuff that I think actually the emergence of Marxism really shatters that kind of like worldview, right? So, but once you strip it of all of its pretensions, what you find is that all the philosophers, even from the beginning, there is something they were concerned with. And it was this idea of like clarifying reality, or deciding what does X mean, right? That's what philosophy does. Even for the most pretentious, like what does reality mean, to like the simplest, like what does this language form mean? Or what does science mean? Or something like that, right? And this is what philosophy has been doing for a long time. And so when I talk about clarity here and bringing that, I'm saying once we strip philosophy of its pretensions, of these kind of mystified pretensions, and this is what I think Marxism does in its emergence, and what it tells us about philosophy and the whole social field. Once we do that, what role is left for philosophy for those of us who are materialists and radicals and devoted to a world-changing project? What role or practice does philosophy have to do? And I argue it has this role to kind of like clarify things in a sense, in this philosophical sense, to be like, here's the theoretical claims that are put forward, here's the practice that we have to do. How does philosophy intervene? How do we as philosophers intervene what is presenting to us? We try to make things clear. And I mean by that, we should be trying to demarcate and strip things of their mystic halo. And I think that philosophy goes really bad, and a lot of philosophy, some of it I like reading, I'll admit it. A lot of continental philosophy will go into this mystified occulting the world again, right? And not bringing clarity, even though it seeks to claim it's giving meaning, it'll also bring in this cloud of like kind of occulting with all these terms that intentionally make it very difficult and obscure, and make it difficult to understand or to translate, right? Go back to that translation thing. And so that's what I'm getting into clarity. Now, I mean, when we bring the question of freedom into this, it's not, I guess, a state of being, but I would say that like, I don't feel it to be very freeing in philosophy, or for philosophy to be very free for people to have to approach philosophy that is not clarified and is obscure and is occulted to them, right? And that they are, they're not allowed to understand these things clearly, because it requires a special language and a special kind of esoteric history and understanding of things. That, I think, that might negatively affect on freedom, right? I think clarifying things in this sense, and this tool is probably good for people's freedom in a broader sense of the term, in being able to include people in a discussion of what philosophy is, to be able to open up philosophy to more people. And I think I'll leave that question at that.
Okay. Should I close this out?
Devin, there's more questions for Devin. I think the one about, can you speak to the distinction between fascism and totalitarianism, is a funny one to have on there.
Oh yeah, you definitely want me to answer that, don't you? Yeah, I mean,
I'll throw in too.
I mean, I have a very short answer about this, is that I don't use totalitarianism as a concept, and I view it to be crafted in such a way to lead people to liberal anti-fascism and reject militant anti-fascism. And that's pretty much the most straightforward way I can answer that. Because totalitarianism, I mean, the only time I sort of get slightly sympathetic to it is when I see Marcuse use it. And even then I'm like, oh, you could have used a different word or something. Because one other aspect is it's so owned by Arendt and Arendt scholarship and Arendt's influence in continental philosophy. And there's her legacy in continental philosophy should trouble us more than it does. And I think it's because people have a very selective reading that sort of ignores a lot of the biases she brought to this, brought to understanding imperialism, or brought to understanding race, or all kinds of things. And so I just basically don't want to get embroiled in that. And I don't think the concept adds to it. For instance, if you read my book, I quote it. I quote Matthew Lyon's definition of fascism, and in it he says a totalitarian vision of collective rebirth as part of it, looking at what Roger Griffin called palingenesis. He says that's part of fascist ideology, and I've talked to him about it, and I said I don't like totalitarian, and he says, look, it's only in there on the and I guess I am speaking for him. Don't take my word for it, but how I understood him to respond to me was to say, it's only because he said the way that the ideology works is it's all encompassing of the life of the people that get involved in it. It organizes their life around ritual and symbols and things that become all encompassing. And so he said, that's why I chose it. And he said, yeah, but I'm not happy with the word either, because of the other things the word can be used for. And so in that way, that's my take on this particular thing. So I'm more inclined to use far right and use fascism as the language. And as many people have pointed out, and is even obvious today, I tend to say far right to get the bigger grouping that I want to look at of these movements, and then narrow it down to fascism in very particular circumstances, in the sense of, be very precise with when you finally want to drop the word fascism on someone, you got to make sure you're really doing it for real on them, because you don't want to inflate the use of the term, because that's a common mistake of discourse in this regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple more questions. There's another one for me that says, how does praxis work for you, Dr. Moufawad-Paul? It seems like a very broad question, though. I mean, praxis working for me, for that, I mean, go back to other things I've written about this. Well, I mean, praxis for me now with the pandemic has been really hard to go out and do organizing work or being part of organizing. I think a lot of people are feeling that with the way that the pandemic exists, and especially in Toronto, and maybe also my life situation has made it harder to be an organizer. But I would say that, praxis in this kind of a revolutionary practice, it in many ways is like you should be part of some kind of, me being coming from like a very specific tradition, which is a Marxist-Leninist Maoist tradition, would be you'd have to be part of building, a Maoist party or a Maoist project in some kind of sense, and part of it's doing mass work, that sort of thing. I mean, there's a lot more written about it. I mean, that's kind of on the side point. I mean, in my book, I do talk about kind of the ways that like philosophers need, all philosophers are kind of involved in a certain kind of, they have a class position. I mean, class, large social class, right? Not just like the simplistic workerist definitions of it. They have political commitments. There's a position that they stand upon. And even, and it might be because they are out doing like kind of organizational work. It might be because they're not, and they just dedicate themselves to certain kind of liberal notions. And then later on, at the end, I try to talk about the way that, philosophy is enriched if it is somehow engaged or connected to a revolutionary project of some sort. And I think that's all I'm going to say about that.
We have one more, and I think both of us can speak to it, actually, Josh. So how about we close with this one? It says, in what ways might your book intersect with what Gabriel Rockhill has written in his recent Counterpunch articles regarding the US always having been fascist? So I said you could speak to this too, because you've read them, and I haven't had a chance to really read them. So I'm getting caught on the wrong foot here. So I'm going to speak actually to someone who is influential in the school of talking about the phraseology of US always having been fascist. So I'm going to speak to a second. So there is an aspect of George Jackson's influence in these kind of discussions. And I've been reading a lot of Jackson and studying Jackson recently in a way that I hadn't really done before my book was finished. And so I'm going to answer it this way and say, when I read Jackson, I think Jackson is very astute in being able to foresee the role that the police and prisons and the judicial system play in the intensification of control and the counter-revolutionary role it plays against revolutionary and emancipatory movements. So Jackson's on that. The one thing I don't like in a way, or that I'm critical of in reading Jackson, is I think we need to step back from this, like the ideas of the US always having been fascist, or the US becoming fascist because of the conditions he just I outlined, for instance, in two senses. One is I believe that it occludes settler colonialism in the United States in some ways that is not, that we need to be more attentive to. And so we need to name it for that. And, you know, someone like Sakai, who I also, you know, am influenced by in the concept of fascism and the discussion of the three-way fight and the role of settlerism, even though I've got some critiques of Sakai, you know, Sakai would have read Jackson. And so when Sakai steps away from that kind of approach to talk about settlerism and things like this, you know, he's mindful of that. And the second thing I think is important is for, if we focus on the US, the United States particular apparatuses as being fascist, there's a rhetorical way where we can get in a trap of US exceptionalism that includes similar structural forms of oppression in other settler colonial societies because they're not as intense appearance being present in Canada, New Zealand, or Australia, just to name the common Anglo-Saxon settler colonial states, historically speaking. And so because the US is like the most intense version of these kinds of practices or forms of oppression, or the most spectacular in the sense of commanding the media, that we lose sight of, you know, for instance, the settler colonialism in Canada and how it has its own aspects of violence attached to it that we need to be mindful of. Anti-Blackness in Canada. Because it's not as, I mean, I hate using spectacular because we have that other meaning of the word spectacular, but you know what I mean in the sense of its kind of bombastic media presentation or its kind of overtness, that we miss the more subtle ways that very similar structures play out in these other places. And so that's why I'm very hesitant to say that. And one other thing I think is really important is sometimes when I read other people talking about this, and I actually view some other people that were publishing this summer, Alberto Toscano and Samir Gandesha, is there's an Enzo Traverso, because lots of people are reading Traverso. Enzo Traverso, they just completely miss the insurgent aspects of it and look purely at state structures. And so that, I think that's really problematic because it's like cutting off half of the dialectic for that, because there's these insurgent aspects that they have to be dealt with. Are they going to be pulled into system loyal aspects, like we saw somewhat happening over the summer? Or are they going to spin back off into system oppositional movements, which of course is happening in the US in this regard? And so I think those are important. I want to keep those questions at the forefront. And sometimes I think when we focus too much on fascism in the way that it's infiltrated state structures, we lose sight of that particular part.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to add much more on that. I think also I like Rockhill's essays in many ways, and I think that what he's drawing from what I've read them is, and this is why I wanted to have you guys in discussion or something, because there's something similar he's doing. It's not like I didn't read those articles as saying that, you know, the US was always fascist because of the state form, but also trying to look at kind of the similarities of fascism in the US with its connection to kind of a settler colonialism and white supremacy that has always been in the US, and also trying to trace the roots out. I mean, a lot of the similarities of your work, Devin, is that he really tries to sync kind of an understanding of the emergence of these new fascist movements connected to like kind of settler colonialism, which is something that often gets lost in writings about them. You even pointed that out in your book about some of the literature that you like, and how it kind of removed this kind of connection with settler colonialism, which you bring back, which is important. I mean, the thing with Gabriel is that he was supposed to come to this event. Where the heck is he? I don't see my list. Is that, you know, I had written, and you had seen it too. I have like an essay that was written for a magazine. I'm not going to say the journal right now, but it's had serious problems with getting it published. It was supposed to come out in August, and it's been like delayed forever. Now with the recent US elections, is completely not as timely as it used to be. But it was trying to answer these questions about like fascism and things as well, stuff I've written on elsewhere in austerity apparatus. And I know Gabriel was interested in having some time where like the three of us could have some discussion about the similarities and differences in the way that we think fascism, but he's not here to throw in on that or a question. And I'm just going to leave it at that. I think that's probably good to end, because now almost 2 hours, and people are fading for a book launch of 2 hours. Maybe we should just end up plugging things again with another story and all the other places, and end in that way.
All right, yeah. So thanks, Josh. Thanks, Devin. This has been great. Just to remind folks, grab the books, leftwingbooks.net, Another Story Bookshop, People's Co-op Bookstore, Roman and Littlefield. I put the links in the chat. Copy and paste them now. Save them. Remember, you could follow all of these folks, including Josh and Devin, on Twitter. And a copy of this virtual book launch will eventually be uploaded to the YouTube channel of Another Story Bookshop. And you'll be able to find it with a simple search, or you can visit their website, anotherstory.ca. With that said and done, I really appreciate everyone. Thanks for signing up. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for the Q&A. And yeah, enjoy your weekend.